Today we are talking with Jonathan Jordan, the author of American Warlords, How Roosevelt's High Command Led America to Victory in the Second World War. Welcome to Redera.
Thank you very much, Manish. Thank you. It's good to be talking to you.
You have a very distinguished background, and you have written several books focusing on wars and the Second World War and other issues related to military. What is American Warlords book focused on? Give us a little bit of overview. And why another book on Second World War and FDR when there are so many out there? Why should readers pay attention to this book as well? Which, by the way, is a very well-written book and very enjoyable book.
Thank you, Manish. American Warlords is really about four men with very, very different professional, political, and personal backgrounds who came together as a team when their country needed them the most. While FDR is a central character in American Warlords, and of course acted as both president and commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, he was assisted in important ways by a trio of men who did a lot of the strategy work, a lot of the nuts and bolts work for him. These were Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who was an old-line Republican from Long Island, a man who was a pillar of the Republican Party and whom Roosevelt tapped during an election year, 1940, to become a cabinet member, the Secretary of War. That was before we had a Secretary of Defense. And that was a radical move on Roosevelt's part. He brought in somebody who was almost a polar opposite of him politically. It would be as if Hillary Clinton announced tomorrow that she was bringing in Paul Ryan to become her Secretary of State in her cabinet. The second man was General George C. Marshall. Marshall was a soldier who viewed himself as one of the guardians of the Republic from a military standpoint, but was very, very careful to ensure that civilian control remained inviolate. Marshall was a man who was trustworthy. He understood how both parties worked together in government, the Republicans and Democrats, and he was careful to cultivate good working relations with each while remaining aloof from politics. He was somebody that both sides trusted, and unlike Roosevelt, he had a very organized mind. He was somebody on a sound footing. The fourth and final character of American Warlords is Admiral Ernest J. King. King was an irascible, hard-drinking, womanizing sailor at heart, but he was a very smart man, and he rose to head the U.S. Navy, which was really our front line of defense in the Pacific War when war broke out. King had a particularly good appreciation for air power. He was constantly fighting the Army Air Forces over control of bombers and planes, and before the war, Admiral King had destroyed the airfields at Pearl Harbor, in theory, in a 1938 war game. So he understood that an air attack on Pearl Harbor was a possibility, and it could be very effective. King preferred to stay away from politicians and journalists as much as he could. So you had four people, Roosevelt, Stimson, Marshall, and King, who came from almost polar opposite sides of the political and professional spectrum, but they set aside their differences and came together and worked for the country's interest when the country needed them most.
Fascinating. When the occasion calls for, people get together and set aside their differences.
They did. It's the kind of willingness to compromise that in the cauldron of war we saw up and down throughout government. These four kind of exemplified it, and that's why they're the lead characters in American Warlords. But the book also talks about other people like Harry Truman, Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House, the Republicans in Congress, Thomas Dewey, the presidential candidate in 1944. These people were willing to compromise as well when the national interest demanded it. And men like Stimson and Dewey were sometimes willing to put themselves at a political disadvantage if that's what the country needed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when you have such a deep and complex war, which is of global proportion, there are many people involved in many different, from different directions and different countries as well. Let's talk more about the main character. I mean, you've done a meticulous research in putting things together. Let's talk a little bit more about the FDR. What is his grand strategy? Was it driven by a strategy, or it was something that he had something that he had to rise to the occasion? Or what drove him, or what was his mindset at that time?
Good questions, Manish. Recall that FDR was a civilian. He had never been in uniform, and the closest he had ever come to war was as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under the Woodrow Wilson administration. He had gotten to France during the First World War and toured some of the battlefields. He stayed well behind the front lines, and like any good politician, he exaggerated his military experience for the rest of his life. But even though he was a novice at military matters, and he created a legacy based on domestic reform of the securities markets and reform of the banks and the real estate industries, getting us out of the Depression and getting Americans to work, he understood that he was going to rely on some strategic planning by his military men. That did not mean he was going to essentially abdicate his responsibilities as commander-in-chief. In fact, he relished pulling the levers of power, and as commander-in-chief, he did that quite often. The strategy that Roosevelt developed was one based on a broad vision of cooperation with the major powers of the world. At first, that was, of course, going to be the United States and Great Britain. And the Atlantic Charter of 1941, signed by Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt, set forth some goals of the war. The war's aims to create a more peaceful world. But that peaceful world had to be accomplished through military strategy in the Second World War, and so Roosevelt had a highly developed sense of when to meddle and when not to. He let his generals and admirals create the military strategy, but he would step in from time to time and overrule those military professionals when he felt the need arose. So you had big decisions such as the invasion of North Africa, the decision as to who would lead the Normandy invasion. You had these big decisions being made at the top by Roosevelt, and he was not shy about overruling his commanders when he thought that they were making the wrong decision. He was, after all, the one who had to balance both the military and political sides of the equation. Nobody else had that dual responsibility.
In many ways, if you look at Hitler, against whom we were all aligned, he was very smart, and he had a better understanding, and he was quite deeply involved in the military strategies, and a great deal of experience, whereas Roosevelt pretty much stayed away from it, yet the outcome was obviously very different for both sides.
Certainly, Roosevelt did not like to get too deep into the details, with one significant exception, and that was the Navy. He sailed small craft as a young boy outside of New York up to Maine along the East Coast. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy previously. He felt a kinship to the Navy. He actually was as a young man, as the Assistant Secretary, he hammered the first ceremonial bolt into the USS Arizona that was famously destroyed by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. So FDR would do things like get involved with the specific types of naval crafting with requests like, why don't we talk about taking off the table a number of 14,000-ton carrier escorts and taking the extra tonnage and putting them into 11,000-ton escort carriers, and we can use that extra material to develop other small craft. And he would come up with these ideas that the Navy would nod and they'd say, yes, sir, and then they'd find a way to bury that under a big pile of paperwork somewhere deep within the Navy Department, and it'd never be heard from again. So Roosevelt meddled at the detailed levels occasionally, but in general, he did not like to overrule his generals and admirals. The Americans felt like the fastest way to win the war was to invade France, go straight into the heart of Germany through northern France, and that's what General Marshall, Marshall's protege, General Eisenhower, Secretary Stimson, all the professionals wanted to do. But Roosevelt knew that the American public would be looking west toward the Pacific. They would say all the fighting we're doing is in the Pacific against the Japanese. If we waited until 1943 to get a big operation going against Germans on the ground, the American public was likely to say, let's finish the job against Japan first and go after Germany second. Well, Roosevelt understood that Germany was the greater threat. He had always been concerned about Hitler and the rise of the Nazi Party. They both Hitler and Roosevelt came to power at about approximately the same time, the first 3 months of 1933. And Roosevelt believed very strongly that if we did not invade someplace in 1942, then we would have a political problem marshaling the forces needed to defeat Germany. So for that reason, he insisted on going someplace that was feasible in 1942, and that one place happened to be North Africa.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What is fascinating about your book is that, there have been many books on focusing on the battles on the ground during the Second World War and how the battles were won and lost and fought. But this book is more about division of resources, allocating resources within various branches of the government and military, and at the same time marshaling resources both between the Allies and within the U.S. Government.
That's right, and Roosevelt had a wonderful sense of how the domestic front, what we now call the home front, was an integral part of the fighting front. Roosevelt always viewed what we did at home to supply the soldier in the field, to get them into the field. That was a big enough project when you were surrounded by two great oceans, more so than probably any other war leader, other than perhaps Stalin. Roosevelt had the greatest understanding of total war, even more so than Hitler, who delayed putting his country on a war economy for some time. In American Warlords, here's how I describe Roosevelt's view of the home front. In Roosevelt's populist vision of total war, the woman in the factory or the child collecting scrap aluminum was as much a warrior as the Marine at Midway or the soldier on Bataan. At every level, Roosevelt said, the nation must match and exceed the efforts of the enemy. This was his view in 1941, shortly after the Pearl Harbor attack, and it would be a theme that he played out over and over. The allocation of limited resources among not just our own Army and Navy, Air Forces, and Marines, but also with the British, the Chinese, the French, the Soviet Union, allies who were desperate for things like American trucks or our steel. Those were problems he had to confront every day. And because of that, Roosevelt looked at the war as simply an extension of Americans' production capacity. This idea of limited resources was something that ground upon General Marshall and Stimson and Admiral King in the early days of the war, and until we got massive resources going by 1943, really, when we started getting enough of what we needed to do the job, then until that time, that was something that was front and center of Roosevelt's radar every day.
And in many ways, of course, the British allies were very helpful, but they really didn't have that many resources. In fact, even to control the vast amount of territory from the Middle East to all the way to the Southeast Asia, they used the Indian Army, which used to be a colony of Britain at that time.
Absolutely. The China-Burma-India theater was an area that was of obviously important concern to Great Britain. It was one that tended to get fewer resources allocated to it because for a couple of reasons. In fact, probably the reason it got what it got was because FDR, in his view of other world leaders, had a couple of blind spots. One of them was in France, where he believed Charles de Gaulle would be kind of a nobody after the war. That was one of his few mistakes in assessing his contemporaries. The other was in overestimating the ability and willingness of Chiang Kai-shek of China to fight the Japanese from the southwest. So Roosevelt pushed to have supplies sent to India, essentially to be flown over the Himalayan hump into southwest China, but essentially that was something that the Americans would have to supply the bulk of because the British lacked the resources to do it. The British provided during the war, until really the middle of the Battle of France, the preponderance of soldiers. They had more out there because while we had millions of soldiers in training camps in the United States, we couldn't get them overseas and get them supplied quickly enough until about 1944. But the British did bring two other things besides their manpower in the early days of the war. They brought their expertise, and they brought their the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy was a solid partner with the United States Navy in protecting the Atlantic supply lines, which got those resources, the food, the steel, the airplane parts over to England and Russia. And their expertise in how to deal with the Germans really gave us a lot of good guidance that I think we probably don't want to appreciate as Americans as much as we probably should for the first part of the war. Eventually, America was able to dictate the strategy of going in through France before we really knew what that war was about, as well as anyone else. We needed the British guidance, and they were great partners in that effort.
Coming back to home and dealing with Congress, dealing with public opinion, and then dealing with various branches of military, give us one or two examples that how all these colorful casts, and many of them with obviously at odds with each other in personal views and professional views, how they all were forced to come together. The book is replete with many examples, but if you want to bring one or two that kind of give us a little bit of taste of it.
Sure. One of the great secrets of the war was the atomic bomb project. The so-called Manhattan Project, named after the Manhattan District Engineering District that was the code name for the bomb, was not only one of the war's biggest secrets, but it was also most tightly guarded secrets. It was also one of the war's most expensive projects. And General Marshall was able to divert funds from things like that were allocated by Congress for things like making newfangled mines and pistols and things like that. He was able to move some of that money over to the A-bomb project, and he felt like he could do that without asking Congress's permission. But eventually the numbers ran into such great amounts. It was hundreds of millions of dollars we were having to continually add to the atomic bomb project. It ended up costing approximately $1.1 billion. That eventually we needed to get Congress involved. Now, Congress has always viewed itself as the guardian of the purse strings, and it jealously guards that prerogative. But the atomic bomb secret was so important that Congress could not be told, could not be trusted with that secret. So that left the Roosevelt administration and General Marshall, Secretary Stimson as well, in the unenviable position of having to go to Congress and say, I need $1 billion and I need you not to ask me what I'm spending it on because it is so important that I can't tell you. Now, to do that, Stimson, Marshall, and some of their top scientists went in and met in private in the office of Speaker Sam Rayburn, the Democratic House Speaker, along with John McCormick, who was the House Majority Leader, and the Republican House Minority Leader, Joseph Martin Jr. And they sat down and they said, we're gonna tell you about a project, but it can't leave this room, and we're going to need you to get the votes to approve the appropriations for this project, but you can't tell anybody why you're doing it. And the men sat around. They agreed that this project was so important that nobody would be allowed to know. They just had basically they would ask congressmen, the rank and file in the House and then the Senate would follow suit, just to trust them. One of the political blow at Roosevelt was his being surprised by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, Dewey knew that we had intercepted some codes by, we had broken some codes of the Japanese. He didn't know exactly which ones they were, but he had enough sources to know that we were reading some of Japan's mail, and he believed that Roosevelt should have known about the attack and probably did know about the attack coming on Pearl Harbor. Well, in private and without the knowledge of Roosevelt or Stimson or any of his bosses, General Marshall, one of the most trusted men in America, went to Dewey, sent an emissary to Dewey with a letter from him saying, I've got to ask you not to make a campaign issue of the Japanese codes, because if you tell the American public that we broke some of Japan's codes, they may change those codes. And if they do, we will be deprived of a source of military intelligence. General Marshall explained that he was reluctant to interfere in anything that would influence politics, but because Japan had never changed those diplomatic codes that we had broken before Pearl Harbor, we were still getting information that would allow us to know things about what Japan was going to do. Dewey had every political interest in refusing Marshall's request. He thought that it might even be a trick by the Roosevelt administration, but in the end he kept quiet about it. He lost the election, and one of the best political hammers he could have used against Roosevelt, he kept in his safe, locked away, because it was in the country's interest for him not to bring that issue up, even though it cost him.
And there have been many people who have given sacrifices and put their differences aside, professional and personal, in order, obviously, to protect the nation's interests. What was it like dealing with a colorful cast or larger-than-life people like Charles de Gaulle or Joseph Stalin or Churchill? And even Eleanor Roosevelt sometimes was influential as well.
Absolutely. Eleanor is in American Warlords as the conscience of Roosevelt's better nature. She was the one who pressed for things like desegregation of the military. She thought it was just wrong to keep black soldiers who were patriotic, who wanted to do their duty, separated and in some cases basically cordoned out of the military in favor of white soldiers, sailors, and officers. She was the one who also pushed for the returning soldiers and sailors and airmen to have benefits from their government, which in what became the popularly known as the GI Bill of Rights. It was the Servicemen's Adjustment Act of 1944. That GI Bill essentially created the American middle class by providing a whole generation of troops, about 15 million servicemen and women with college educations, with home loans, business loans, and things like that. Eleanor Roosevelt, to the Army, was kind of a gadfly, a thorn in their side. She was the one always pushing them to do the right thing, even though they believed that in wartime, social experiments such as desegregation were absolutely the wrong thing to do. Charles de Gaulle was a one-issue person. He was there only to protect the interests of France. And FDR was a partner with Eleanor, but he was an antagonist to some extent with de Gaulle, whom he viewed as someone who was really creating more problems for the alliance than was worth. What he did not understand, what Roosevelt didn't understand, was that de Gaulle was really the only voice of the resistance in France, and he became the de facto French leader once the tide of war had turned. And it was very, very difficult keeping him in line. Roosevelt did not like the man personally. De Gaulle had been very rude to Roosevelt. Roosevelt, of course, was in a wheelchair, and when they met, de Gaulle would stand over him and look down at him. De Gaulle was a very tall man and was just very irascible. He was constantly looking for more prestige, more power, more resources than Roosevelt felt he deserved under the circumstances. Winston Churchill was, of course, one of the most famous men of the 20th century, and began the war as the man who was guiding the Americans into the right approach to the destruction of Nazi Germany. One of Churchill's assistants referred to the British as being kind of like during the times of the emperors of Rome, where the Greek slaves would really run the empire. And the British viewed themselves as the men who ran the war, just with the nominal authority of the Americans. Churchill began the war as the senior partner, essentially, in military strategy, but very quickly became the secondary character, and Roosevelt was soon able to make decisions such as who would command Overlord, or Roosevelt could make the final decision on things like whether General Eisenhower would direct his forces to the capture of Berlin or not. And finally, Joseph Stalin was something of an enigma. He does not show up in American Warlords until late 1943, when Roosevelt and Stalin meet together for the first time. Roosevelt always felt that all men were basically alike. All politicians were essentially alike. And if he had a personal connection with them, Roosevelt could win over virtually anyone as his friend. Well, that was a lot more difficult with Stalin, who came from a very different background than Roosevelt did. And so Roosevelt had a much harder time working with Stalin in the long run, although he held out much hope for many, many years throughout the war, a long time, I should say, that he could work with Stalin to create a structure of world peace after the war's end.
Fast forwarding towards the end of the war, and of course the war did end, we know the outcome, but were there any lessons to be learned, or were there any surprises to be found? And of course there were many, as we look upon, as we kind of look back to the war 5 years or 10 years or 20 years later, in understanding the characters, in understanding the strategies, understanding the role of military in this kind of grand wars.
I think we had, I'd say, the biggest surprise that Americans had, and this was really something that would have been a surprise to Roosevelt had he lived another 5 or 10 years, was the difficulty the United States would have with dealing with the Soviet Union. Roosevelt had no illusions about the antithetical natures of capitalist and communist systems. He met Stalin again in his second meeting of the war at Yalta in 1945, February 45. Roosevelt was just a few months away from dying, and was ill. And after the war, he was criticized for giving in so much to Joseph Stalin, that he had essentially been hoodwinked by the Soviet dictator into giving up Eastern Europe. What I think is we don't remember as clearly is the fact that the Red Army had 3 million soldiers throughout Eastern Europe, just on the front area, and they were all over Poland. They were all throughout much of Eastern Europe, and there was no way the United States had the leverage to do much more than ask for Russian guarantees of fair and free elections, promises that the Soviet Union immediately broke in the war's aftermath. Roosevelt, in addition to his health problems, and in addition to the military imbalance in Eastern Europe, was faced by one other consideration that we tend to forget, and that is he was desperate to get a United Nations, an international peacekeeping organization established to help guide the world through peace after the war's end. And he was willing to put up with a lot of demands from Stalin in order to get a United Nations. So in the end, the negotiations, the diplomatic side that Roosevelt led at Yalta, and then really from the fall of 1944 up through Roosevelt's death, set off an era of a Cold War, but it also produced the United Nations that has in limited areas been able to mitigate some of the wars that we've had. So it's been kind of a mixed bag, and we tend to think of the Iron Curtain as dropping down, and we wonder why we didn't see the evil empire for what it was. It certainly was evil in many ways, but in the political and military balance at the time, Roosevelt did not have very much leverage in Eastern Europe, unlike Western Europe.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Was it also the beginning of ending the Imperial Britain and financially basically making the country less and less relevant on a global stage, because Britain was very much overextended in many ways, and in fact even after the war ended, I think Roosevelt sent some kind of a naval power to take over some of the British Navy vessels near South Africa to settle the debts that were supposed to be paid, but that were never paid until that act was carried out.
Absolutely, Manish, that's a very good point. We tend to think of the immediate post-war time as a boom time for America. I gave a speech a few weeks ago sponsored by the National World War II Museum and talked about post-war America, and I had a question from a British audience member about how that contrasted with Britain's post-war experience. Britain came through the war with its resources exhausted. It was deeply in debt to the United States. It was overextended. There were national liberation movements going on in many of its colonies, England being foremost, of course. 2 years after the war's end, it became independent. So Great Britain had a very different experience after the war than the United States did. Now, the smaller characters in the book, Stimson to some extent, and then certainly Marshall and Admiral King, they didn't care about politics. They were very careful to keep military and political matters separate and not interfere with the second one. But Roosevelt was had an anti-colonial bent to him. He was very much a populist. He was particularly contemptuous of the way France had run its colonies. He said that he didn't think that France had really brought anything through colonialization to French Indochina, what we now call Vietnam. And while he was much more muted about British colonialism, he certainly had very little sympathy to it. At one point, he sent a letter to Winston Churchill, a top secret personal letter, and he said, I think maybe you ought to think about giving some measure of independence to India. And Churchill snapped back that essentially it was none of Roosevelt's business. And it was clear that this was a sore spot, and Roosevelt was reluctant to bring it up again. The United States, of course, had its colonies. We just didn't call them that in places like the Philippines and some of the Pacific Islands. But Roosevelt's view of colonialization was something that was on its way out as a historical matter.
Yeah, and what was Russia's experience in the immediate 10 years, of course, after the war? It took a different course. I think in many ways people underappreciate that the 3 million soldiers around Eastern Europe gave Russia or Soviet Union a lot of territory, but Soviet Union did not have the economic or financial wherewithal to hang on to it or build on it or develop it.
The Soviet Union had recovered from somewhere, estimates vary wildly, but somewhere between 20 million and 70 million deaths. Probably closer to I believe it's about 7 million military combat deaths, but then the vast majority were deaths due to starvation, just broad executions and things like that. It was a horrendous experience that left the Soviet Union highly scarred, and this was a scar that was not unfamiliar to it. It had been invaded by Charles XII of Sweden and by Napoleon and by the Mongols and by the Teutons. So it viewed its security, particularly its security on its western border, as it's an issue that there could not only be no compromise on, but it required an increasingly large buffer state. And what Russia, I think, did not mind, and everybody called them, in the West called them Russians, not Soviets. What the Russians did not fully grasp was the cost, the economic infrastructure required to support a standing army to defend a buffer state with that much depth, with the depth going all the way to Berlin. So it was something that I think ultimately proved the downfall of the Soviet model, because they had put so much into their military economy. They had created the kind of imbalance that Roosevelt, who was very economically wise, was good about avoiding. One example, it's in American Warlords, was when Secretary Stimson came to FDR one time complaining about price controls. He said, we could get more suppliers to produce parts and materials for our tanks if you just let some of the price controls off. And Roosevelt looked at him and he said, well, that's a good point. We could probably create more tanks right now, and that would make the military's job a little bit easier right now. But if we started cutting back on price controls, there would be a boom in prices. And then when the war ended, there would be a great drop in prices. And I don't want something precipitous to happen after the war. We've got to think about how that war is progressing and how it's functioning with our economy. And Roosevelt was much more far-sighted in terms of balancing the military and economic side of the equation than I believe the Soviet leaders were, who, of course, were fighting for their lives at one point, and they had other priorities.
Indeed. All the global resources, so to speak, were aligned against the Nazi Party and the Hitler and Germany. And of course, after the war, there were two different outcomes that people sometimes fail to compare. Russia, which was victorious, Britain, that was victorious. Yet Germany, that was fully destroyed, bounced back, got organized, got very efficient, and rose to the world stage in tremendous trade and global trade and innovation and productivity, whereas the other two nations just kind of, one obviously became very laggard and the other lost its preeminent position, Britain.
There's one chapter in American Warlords that deals with what was called in late 1944 the Morganthou Plan. Henry Morganthou, Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury, was a person who was convinced that German nationalism would pose a threat to world peace for virtually all times unless the Germans were reduced to a pre-1870 agrarian economy, essentially. And he wanted to demolish the Ruhr area of Germany, its industrial heartland, and turn Germany into basically a pastoral country that would never be permitted to own heavy industry. Roosevelt went along with that at first and then kind of woke up and realized this would be a disaster for Central Europe and for the economy of Europe in the post-war world in general. And Stimson was very much in favor of allowing Germany to rebuild its economy, but keeping very tight limits on Germany's military capabilities. As Roosevelt put it in a public announcement, we want to see that Germany re-enters the community of nations after the war, but it is a very steep hill they're going to have to climb up to join us, and we want to make sure that while they climb up that hill, they are not burdened by the weight of a lot of heavy weapons. And that's the way it ultimately turned out. Roosevelt died before he could see Germany becoming an industrial and economic powerhouse because it did not have to place a large portion of its economy, build a large portion of its economy on its military might.
Very well said. We've been speaking with Jonathan Jordan, the author of American Warlords, How Roosevelt's High Command Led America to Victory in Second World War. So much about the book and so much about the Second World War. Tell us a little bit more about the author. How did you get interested in this topic and how your career has developed? You've been a fascinating author and also a very interesting speaker as well.
Well, thank you. Manish, I grew up in the 1970s. My father flew for the United States Air Force for many years. And during the 1970s, there were only, as a kid, you'd find that there were only 4 channels on television. And a lot of those channels were rerunning the big budget war movies of the 60s and 70s, Midway and Tora, 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 and A Bridge Too Far, those big budget Technicolor films that I used to watch as a kid. And in the movies, you would see these great generals, these great leaders, and they would look almost like colorized marble statues. But I began to think when I got a little bit older that those leaders had to start somewhere. And once they got into power, how did they conduct their business on a day-to-day basis? They were not always striking heroic poses, and some days it would be a tough day at the office, and they'd come back and they'd put their feet up on the desk and put their helmet to one side, and they might grouse, they might have good days and bad days. They had to work with people, and I began to realize that relationships are the driving force of how our military works. There's individual heroism on the battlefield and other places, of course, but we've all got to work together as a team. The relationships are what drives the modern military. And so my latest book, American Warlords, and the book that preceded it, Brothers, Rivals, Victors, which is about the personal and professional friendships of Generals Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley, both before and during the war, are all about how people with different backgrounds different personalities create a relationship that works in the pressure cooker of combat. So seeing these people who we ultimately lionized as great leaders, we knew that they had to come from somewhere. And so part of American Warlords and Brothers, Rivals, Victors and the other books I've written have been about how those people got their start. In the modern context, we look at men like Martin Luther King Jr. But of course, before he was a civil rights leader, he was a kid somewhere in Atlanta. He was just little Marty, and he eventually had to grow into the big shoes he later filled. And Franklin Roosevelt was the same way. He did not start off as a wise war leader. He was not always the person who made every decision correctly. He had some good days and some bad days. He had a terrible day after Pearl Harbor was attacked. He was despondent, but he functioned. He did his job anyway. He soldiered through it the way a good commander should. And seeing how these people are on their bad days and when they have to work with difficult partners is part of the driving force of the story of American Warlords.
Are you working currently? Are you teaching somewhere, or are you just writing the books, or you have other engagement as well, or are you generally, do you like to speak as well?
I love speaking, and really it's to me the personal interaction with the audience in the question and answer time, kind of like we're doing today, is something that I love best about talking, because then you hear what other people are thinking about. What they come up with points you hadn't considered, and they have insightful questions that I love to talk about. But right now I'm working on a couple of other books. My daughter and I are working on one called Queen of Swords, Women Who Have Led Their Nations in Wartime Throughout History. And it's about women from a 18th dynasty pharaoh all the way up through Margaret Thatcher of the Falklands War, and how they've made decisions about whether to go to war and how to conduct those wars. The modern women, Indira Gandhi, Golda Meir, the medieval women, Katerina Sforza, Queen Elizabeth, women like that, and then the ancients, such as Cleopatra, are all women who figure in that story. The other book I'm working on now at its developing stages is about the personal relationship between Eisenhower and Churchill that began, of course, at the beginning of World War II. They actually met in late 1941 in Washington. And it developed into quite a remarkable personal friendship in which Eisenhower took on and learned much from Churchill. Churchill got Eisenhower into painting, for instance. He helped teach him about great statesmanship and broad vision. But just as the Americans started out as the junior partners in the Second World War and eventually became the senior partners, Eisenhower went from being the major general whom Churchill briefly met in Washington and was kind of a nondescript guy, all the way up through President of the United States during Churchill's second premiership in the mid-1950s, when America was the dominant power, and Churchill was the one who was essentially asking Eisenhower to try to start a new era of better relations with the Soviet Union after Stalin's death. So that story of how this personal and political friendship evolved over basically a 13-year period from the 1940s to the mid-50s, and then beyond as a pure friendship, is the heart of my next book.
Thank you very much for your time and your comments, and please keep us in mind when you have your new books ready. We would certainly like to hear from you again, and our audience will certainly enjoy that.
Well, I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you again.